Hello everyone, and welcome back to my series where I look at every single Zelda game, giving them a review and examining the ways that they iterate on the games that came before. Today we're looking at what most people would call the black sheep of the series, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Released in 1987 for the Famicom and 1988 for the NES, this game took a drastic gameplay shift into being predominantly a side-scroller. Based on that alone, you would think that it was also a complete shift away from the design of the first game. And the answer to that question is, well, yes and no. From a certain point of view, it throws out everything that worked in Zelda 1. But from another point of view, it took the core of the first game, which was the feeling of going on an adventure, and went to great lengths to deliver the same feeling in a new way. Either way, it's going to be a different beast this time around, so let's dig a little deeper into what exactly Zelda 2 is all about. Here's a reminder of how these videos are structured, and let's get started. On the base level, the plot of Zelda 2 is no more complicated than the plot of Zelda 1. Once again, the in-game story crawl doesn't really explain much, so once again we turn to the manual. A few years after he saved Hyrule the first time, the symbol of the Triforce mysteriously appears on Link's hand. Impa recognizes what this means based on the legends of her people, and tells Link that he can put 6 crystals in the 6 palaces around Hyrule to obtain the Triforce of Courage, and use its power to awaken the sleeping Princess Zelda, who, by the way, is not the same Princess Zelda from the first game. Yeah, unless you play the Japanese version, that's not in the in-game text crawl, it's only in the manual. Why was this detail cut in the NES version, Nintendo? Do you think we're too stupid to understand the idea of there being 2 Zeldas in Zelda 2? Yeah, alright, you got me there. Anyway, this Zelda was cursed many years ago, and in her honor, all female children of the royal family are also named Zelda. This also adds the mildly creepy fact that it's implied Link is kissing the first Zelda's mini-great's aunt at the end of the game. Link's only 16 in this game, lady. This is basically cradle robbing. If you were paying attention though, I said that on the base level, Zelda 2 isn't more complicated than the first game. Beat the dungeons, kill the baddies, save the princess, it's all fairly standard stuff. However, there's a little bit more to this game, and that is establishing a world. You can see it as early as comparing the two manuals. Zelda 1's doesn't really tell you anything besides the stuff about Ganon, but Zelda 2's actually gives us backstory. The monsters aren't a generic evil army now. I mean, they still are because it's literally the same army as last time, but now their motivation is a lot more personal. Link killed their boss in the last game, so now they want to kill Link and take his blood so that they can mix it with Ganon's ashes and revive him, which is a detail that I absolutely love. It's just so dark. The manual also establishes that Hyrule had a succession issue, which led to a fight between the prince and the princess, which a magician then escalated into the curse that was placed on Zelda. It even subtly implies that the kingdom fell apart because of this event, referring to Hyrule as once united. And that idea is kind of backed up by the gameplay too, because Hyrule in-game is literally split in two, separated by a vast ocean. But that kind of is where the story starts falling a little flat. Zelda 2 doesn't just expand on the world in the manual, it tries to make Hyrule feel like an actual world in the gameplay too. I gave the first game credit for having distinct, recognizable areas, and while that does help establish a sense of place, it doesn't really make it feel like a living world. Zelda 2, though, has roads and towns and people who have their own concerns, and it almost works, but the game doesn't really deliver on what it tries to do. This game has a bunch of quests where you help out regular people, like saving a kidnapped child or finding a potion to heal an old woman's sick daughter. It lets you actually feel like a hero. Sometimes. All of the town quests follow the same structure of go get this thing for me, probably to save on memory so that they don't have to program multiple kinds of quests. Now, the odd, inane fetch quest might not detract too much from a bigger game, but when it's all you're doing, it starts to feel like busy work. Oh, you're thirsty, are you? Can't walk 3 steps to the left and get your own water? Don't worry, Link the errand boy is here to help. It's not like there's an army literally out for my blood or anything, it's fine. There are also things scattered around the land of Hyrule that raise interesting questions, like, why are there partially built roads in Midorot Swamp? Did people try to reclaim it at one point, or was it abandoned and the swamp grew up around it? What's the deal with King's Tomb, and why does Error of all people know how it relates to the Secret Island Passage? Is Error connected to the royal family somehow? Why does Bug live in the middle of the woods but is still well respected in the town of Saria? And yeah, his name is Bug. I know it says Bagu on screen, but that's a mistranslation. He's supposed to go together with Error and Bug. Get it? Actually though, if Error is connected to the royal family and Bug is connected to Error, then maybe that explains why Bug is so respected. You see, these things are really fun to think about, but the game doesn't even hint at an answer to any of them. Doing so would use up valuable storage space, and that space is better spent elsewhere. I think I can wrap up this section by saying that I genuinely respect Zelda 2's attempt to flesh out the world of Hyrule, but it's just not quite there yet. Zelda 2 is split between two main gameplay types. One is very similar to the previous game, navigating the overworld is still done through a top-down perspective. While in the overworld, you're looking for towns, palaces, and secrets. You eventually get items that you can use in the overworld, like the hammer to break blocks and the whistle to calm down the river devil. Unlike in Zelda 1 though, combat and traversing the overworld are not done at the same time. Instead, when you find an enemy, you transition into a separate battle scene. These are determined by where in the overworld you encounter the monster, and are also where the game becomes a side-scroller. You can move, duck, jump, and stab with your sword. The sword beam is back, coming out when you have full health, but a lot of enemies this time are just immune to it. Later, you can learn the up and down slash, letting you attack things above and below you. The shield returns, blocking attacks automatically when you aren't attacking, but now attacks can come at different heights. You now have to duck to block low attacks, or just jump over them. Link also gains access to several spells, which is a new system for the series, although most of them are pretty situational. Some of them are enhancements that work best against certain enemies like fire and reflect, some of them are extra movement options like jump and fairy, and some of them are just generally useful like shield and life. Side-scrolling is also how you explore locations, palaces, towns, and traps. Towns don't usually have much need for combat, although there are exceptions. Instead, the attack button is used to talk to people and also to interact with certain things. This is where you can restock on life and magic, do quests to get new abilities, and find hints on what to do next. Traps are structured combat encounters. Usually they're only a few screens long, serving to block progress. They can take the form of caves, bridges, really any square in the game could be a trap. I'm also going to lump secrets in here, because heart and magic containers, as well as quest items, are usually found at the end of traps, although there are a few that are just free if you find them. Palaces serve the same role dungeons did last time. They're labyrinths that are full of enemies and hazards. There are keys to find, items to acquire, and bosses to defeat. Beating a palace also nets you a level up. Yeah, Zelda 2 has an XP system. Link has 3 stats. Life increases your defense, magic decreases the cost of spells, and attack makes your sword do more damage. Speaking of new things in Zelda 2, this game also has a lives system. You start with 3 lives, and if you lose them, that's game over. You're back to the very first screen of the game, although thankfully you don't lose dungeon items or spells, just XP. This isn't like the original Super Mario Bros. Where it's a full reset or anything. I think that's about it for gameplay systems, so let's look at how well Zelda 2 utilizes them. Zelda 2 was developed by a different team from the first game, and as such Zelda 2 was not directed by Miyamoto and Tezuka. Instead, Miyamoto had the concept of a game where up and down movement was used for attacking and defending, and while he did work as a producer for the game, it was directed by Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura. Tezuka was involved in the game's story, but he didn't work on level design this time. This game, from its initial concept, was meant to explore gameplay scenarios that the first game couldn't, hence why a side-scroller approach was selected. It allowed for the up and down combat focus, while also enabling the game to have platforming and all the new gameplay options that entails. It's also why this game borrowed from RPGs. Having an XP system and random encounters would encourage players to engage with the new combat system, instead of just walking past enemies like you could in the first game. The combat itself is fine, for the most part. The up and down focus is apparent almost immediately, with enemies that require ducking to block their projectiles or to hit them in the first place. Some enemies don't use it as an element, like the definitely not Hammer Brothers, or the Axe Guys in Death Mountain, but most enemies use it in some way. And for most of the enemies that use it, up and down blocking and attacking works well. Unfortunately, the most common type of enemy that uses it are shield enemies, and it's when you get to shield enemies that the up and down combat stops working so well. Specifically the enemies whose shields also move up and down, like the Iron Knuckles and the Lizalfos. I think the intended idea with them is to try and juke them out, like attack high and then attack low to catch them off guard. In practice though, they attack too fast to give you a chance to do that, and you have to go back on the defense way too soon. I have a lot of footage of me grinding Lizalfos and trying to play strictly using up and down movements, and the best way I found to do it was to just spaz out at them and not care if they hit you in return, which isn't very fun. Luckily, there is a way around that, the jump slash. If you jump at an enemy and time your attack to hit their head, it'll connect 90% of the time. Sometimes they block it, so it does kinda feel like an exploit, but I don't care because jump slashes are really fun. They feel viscerally satisfying. It's like getting a parry in Bloodborne, it just never gets old. And it's the reason why I actually like fighting most of these shield enemies. In fact, my favorite enemy in the game is the blue Iron Knuckle. It attacks slowly at first, and then when you hit it, it goes into a fast sequence of knife throws, forcing you onto the defensive until it slows down again, and then you repeat until it's dead. It gives fighting them a satisfying push and pull, which would be ruined if you didn't have a consistent method of landing hits. It also means shield enemies you can't reliably jump slash are a pain to fight, specifically the bird knuckles in the Great Palace. I hate those guys. I guess that's as good a place as any to talk about the game's difficulty. It's become rather infamous for how hard it is online, so it might have surprised some of you that it took me this long to mention it. I haven't yet because, with the exception of one glaring flaw that we'll discuss in a minute, I don't mind the difficulty. There's a special place in my heart for really hard side-scrollers. I love games like Celeste and Shovel Knight, for example. In fact, I tried to play Zelda 2 right after I first beat Zelda 1 in college, but I couldn't get into it because at that time I was playing a lot of AVGN adventures, which scratched my hard side-scroller itch. Zelda 2 is a little different from those games though by not being level-based. I guess you could say that the palaces are like levels, but here you have to actually get to them. Zelda 2, much like the RPGs that partially inspired it, is a game about the long haul. You have to actually find the locations you need to get to, and then you have to manage your health and magic on the way there to make sure you have enough to actually survive. Town serves as a sort of checkpoint, letting you refill your resources. There is a bit of a problem with how this is executed though. Unlike an RPG, there's no items you can carry with you to help with the journey. No potions, no ethers, none of that. If you get into a sticky situation, you have to rely on enemy drops, and since enemies no longer drop health pickups, magic jars are the only thing that can potentially save you, and usually they don't show up fast enough to be helpful. Worse than that though is that magic is required for progression in some places, and if you don't have any, you either have to grind for it or eat a death to refill it. I think that's the point of these ceiling drip things that infinitely spawn bits and bobs, so that you can always farm magic and don't get soft locked. On the whole though, the game world is dense enough that towns and other helpful things like extra magic jars or fairy fountains are never too far away. It can be annoying when it comes up, usually in palaces, but I wouldn't classify it as unfair. There certainly are unfair elements to the difficulty in Zelda 2 though, like the severe knockback that makes dealing with enemies over lava really unfun. But generally speaking, I like how hard this game is. Like I said before, this kind of game is my jam. Of course, there is still that big, glaring flaw I mentioned earlier, and unfortunately, it's the kind of flaw that makes all the other flaws infinitely worse. I'm talking, of course, about the life system. If you die 3 times, you go all the way back to the first screen of the game. This, in scientific terms, sucks. It especially sucks because Zelda 2 is one of the few games I can think of where the life system actually serves a purpose. In a lot of cases, life systems only exist to waste time. In a game like Mario, for example, dying already sets you back to nothing. You lose all your power-ups and you're sent back to either the start of the level or to a checkpoint. Making you redo an entire world, or the entire game, just wastes time. In Zelda 2 though, dying refills your health and magic. For a game that's about managing those resources, making it so that you can't abuse death makes some amount of sense. But why couldn't they have just put you back at the start of the palace? I mean, that's what they do for the final palace, why not do that all the time? Or maybe they could have respawned you in the last town you visited, or at set respawn points. Like, I don't know, throw some churches around where you come back to life, or something. Literally anywhere besides the very beginning of the game would have been better than what we got. It's a total pace killer, and you can't even farm lives like you can if you have trouble in Mario. I mean, you technically can, because once you reach max level, every new level gives you an extra life. But that requires first grinding to max level, and then grinding even more for extra lives, which is a very time-consuming process. And to make matters worse, for some reason the NES version has much higher XP requirements for everything. The Famicom version caps out at 4,000, while the NES version caps out at 9,000. It's kind of funny. Usually the version of the game that's made for the West is made less grindy to accommodate our impatient culture, but it makes grinding for lives that much more unfeasible. But, to be fair to Zelda 2, this was just how games were made at the time. Games couldn't be very big, the technology just wasn't there yet, so they were made harder to compensate. The more you had to replay a section, after all, the longer you'd be playing the game. Knowing that doesn't really excuse the bad parts of old games, but it is helpful for understanding why they are the way they are. Besides, any version of this game you're likely to play these days has save states built in, so make use of them. And before you ask, I only use save states to retry the last 2 bosses. I don't care if you think that invalidates my opinion. It's not like I save stated after every hit or anything, I just did it to skip having to walk back through the palace. I'd be Dark Link without using the corner trick, and you can't take that away from me. That's about all I have to say about the live system, but before I move on, I want to point out something I thought was neat. You see, when you go back to an old game with a life count, it's always a gamble as to whether 0 actually counts as a life or not. Zelda 2, though, actually has it both ways. The life counter that appears on screen when you die will show 1 as your last life, But if you pause the game, there's another life counter that will show 0 as your last life. It's just a weird little thing I noticed. Let's move on now. In spite of everything I've just said though, I still enjoyed my time with Zelda 2. The combat is smooth and usually satisfying. There are enemies that are annoying, and there is some real unfair nonsense, especially toward the end of the game. But on the whole, I had fun. The structure of the game is also much more streamlined. Instead of giving you the whole world at once, you instead explore a series of smaller areas that are locked behind key items, with the world gradually getting bigger as you go. For example, you need the candle from the first palace to access the southwestern part of the map where the second palace is. This game also has some nice moments of teaching you how to play it wordlessly. After getting the down stab, for instance, the next thing you need to do involves falling into a hole right onto a group of enemies. It immediately presents a situation where the down stab is valuable, and therefore it teaches you to value it. The game does this a few times, where a situation that a power-up would be useful for is located right next to it, like the boots letting you skip the maze before the palace you find them in. Although this moment where you have to navigate falling blocks before getting the glove has the potential to, do that. There's also not as many instances where I think a guide is necessary. A combination of the smaller area to search and the hints this time around being better means that you aren't likely to get lost. There are a few moments where you might need some outside help, like finding the mirror beneath the table that you have no indication exists, or having to Santa Claus your way into a house to get the upstab. So I'd still recommend you keep a guide on hand, even if it isn't as necessary this time around. The story is more ambitious, trying to expand the world of Hyrule by giving it its own history, and I do appreciate the attempt even if it doesn't quite hit the mark. The up and down focus combat is a nice idea, even if jump slash is somewhat invalidated. I'd like to see a game that tries this kind of combat, and where playing it the way it was intended is more fun than cheesing it. Overall, I found myself wishing at many points that Nintendo would remake this game. Apparently that was an idea back when the Super Famicom was around, with Miyamoto stating that he felt Zelda 2 was held back by the hardware of the time. They were going to remake it using the system's polygon functionality though, so actually it's probably a good thing they didn't do it back then. I can't imagine it would have looked good. But yeah, if you fix the live system, and flesh out the things that don't quite work, and expand on the things that do, I think a lot of people would really enjoy a remake. I certainly would. We should have more to talk about in this section, seeing as we actually have the first game to compare to this time. Before that though, let's talk graphics and sound. The graphics this time around are a little better than last time. The overworld graphics are about on the same level as Zelda 1. Like last time, there is effort put into making areas unique, and Zelda 2 adds swamps and islands to the repertoire of locations, but it's still kinda basic. The side-scrolling sections are where the real improvements add. They add some nice detail, and for stuff that was in the previous game, the difference is very noticeable. Look at caves in Zelda 1 compared to caves in Zelda 2, and you'll see what I mean. The palaces all now have different looks to them, as opposed to the first game where the dungeons just had different colors. Despite that though, the sprites this time aren't as memorable as those in Zelda 1. That's not just because Zelda 1 is more well known than Zelda 2 either, there also isn't as much character in them this time. No enemies making funny faces here, and nothing sticks out to me as being as charming as the smirk in the first game's item get sprite. It feels like they wanted Zelda 2 to have a more serious tone than the first game, but without those things, the sprite work doesn't do a lot to stick out. There is more variety to the regular townsfolk this time around though. Zelda 1 only had the shopkeep, the old man, and the old woman. Here we got kids, this lady carrying around a pot, the knights, and Error. Why are you everywhere? Zelda 2 even brought back the weird thing from the first game, where some of the monsters help you out. In the audio department, the soundtrack this time around wasn't composed by Koji Kondo, the guy who did the first game and would go on to do most of the series. Instead, Akito Nakatsuka composed this game, and he brings a different sound to it. There are plenty of songs I like in Zelda 2. I like the palace theme, the overworld theme, and the town theme. There aren't really any songs I dislike either, the way that I disliked Zelda 1's dungeon theme. However, there also aren't any songs I can say that I love, like I can about the title screen or overworld theme for Zelda 1. It's a good soundtrack overall. My favorite song is probably the title screen theme, but it hasn't really stuck around in the larger context of the series. I don't know if that's because Koji Kondo is secretly super petty, or if the soundtrack just isn't that memorable, but it is true that songs from this game don't come back much. Now, let's actually compare the design of these games. Let's start with what's better in Zelda 2. Zelda 2 is much better in terms of sword combat. Fighting in Zelda 1 is awkward, owing to the four-directional movement that makes the controls feel stiff. In contrast, Zelda 2 plays perfectly fine, although when you weigh up all your combat options, it gets a little more muddled. Zelda 2 is, more than anything else, a sword fighting game. Other combat options technically exist, but none of them are very good. The sword beam only does damage to some enemies, and the only other ranged option is the fire spell, which is slow and never feels worth it. I guess there's also the thunder spell, but considering how the game is about managing magic, the thunder spell is never worth its cost. The point is, there are no good ranged options in Zelda 2. Zelda 1, though, has a sword beam that's actually worth using, as well as the bow, magic rod, boomerang, even the bombs and candle have combat use if you try hard enough. Zelda 1 definitely has more variety, but if I had to pick one combat system to be stuck with, I'd pick Zelda 2. That movement in Zelda 1, man, it's just so hard to get over it. On top of that, Zelda 2 has the much better story of the two. Hyrule feels way more alive in Zelda 2, and its justification for what's going on is way better too. Why do you save Zelda in the first game? Because Ganon is a bad guy, and also if you didn't, there wouldn't be a video game. Why do you save Zelda in the second game? Because her brother got angry that she was hiding information about who the next king would be, and a magician took that anger and used it to curse his sister against his own wishes. You are righting an ancient wrong. And also the bad guy you killed last time wants your blood. Can't forget about that. What I'm saying is there are both more and more interesting layers between the part where the story only exists so a video game can happen, and that's always worth celebrating. Now, what are the things Zelda 1 is better at? Well, that sentiment pretty much begins and ends at exploration. For starters, the map system in Zelda 1 is much better, in the sense that it actually has one. In Zelda 2, you just gotta remember where you've been. Zelda 2 is also a much more restrictive game, overall. I mentioned before how parts of the map in Zelda 2 are locked behind key items, and that simply isn't the case in Zelda 1. You can get to nearly every screen in Zelda 1 right from the word go, the only exceptions being the two places where you need the raft. Zelda 1 also has more complicated dungeon layouts. Probably due to the lack of a map, the palaces in Zelda 2 are pretty basic. Also, they don't make cool shapes anymore. Finally, and this is a weird thing to try and put into words, Zelda 1 feels like a game where being prepared is actually the result of your actions. Zelda 1 is all about freedom, and as a result it always felt like you were the one who made the call for when you were ready to do anything. If you really want to, you don't even need to get the sword in Zelda 1 until the final boss. That's how open it is. Zelda 2, though, railroads you much more. As a good comparison, you can only ever have one extra heart container before doing the first palace in Zelda 2. As opposed to the first game where you can have found 3 heart containers before entering the first dungeon. You always need to at least enter the palaces in the order they appear in, since you need their key items to get to the next section. Even something that seems optional at first is actually a required part of the main path. Yeah, you actually need every magic container in the game before the old man in Kasuto will teach you the Thunder Spell, which is required for beating the game. So, the big question. Is Zelda 2 a good follow-up to Zelda 1? I said in my last video that the feeling of freedom was the best part of Zelda 1, and Zelda 2 threw that away to be more linear. Does that make Zelda 2 a bad sequel? Well, maybe. When you break it down into its simplest terms, Zelda 2 isn't actually that different. You're still let loose in the world, you prepare as much as you can by finding secrets and upgrades, and then you do a palace. The biggest difference is that it's more linear, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, with linearity comes a chance to be more focused. Zelda 2 fixes the problem of Zelda 1 having a bad hint system. It's never that hard to figure out what you should be doing in Zelda 2. There are exceptions, but unlike Zelda 1, I don't think this game is barely playable without a map. Then again, being restrictive could be seen as the ultimate sin toward the design of the first game. Freedom was the #1 priority in Zelda 1, and Zelda 2 threw that away. Then again, Zelda 2's smaller world might have allowed for there to be more dialogue, and since this game was trying to world build more, that could be seen as a worthy sacrifice. Then again, Zelda 2 has much less variety and options. Being prepared in Zelda 2 is almost strictly a numbers game compared to the first game where extra combat options were an important part of the game. Then again, Zelda 2's combat is much smoother overall, but then again... I think you're starting to see why comparing Zelda 1 and 2 is complicated. Depending on who you are and what you like, you could make the argument that Zelda 2 is a good sequel or a bad sequel. If you liked the freedom and the feeling of exploring a big world that the first game has, then Zelda 2 is a bad sequel. It's much more linear and restrictive, there aren't as many secrets to find, and it's just generally a smaller game. Meanwhile, if what you want is the feeling of being a wandering hero, then Zelda 2 is a good sequel. You can interact with the townsfolk and help them with their problems, the higher difficulty makes it feel like a raising of the stakes, and the world is more fleshed out. In its own way, it is still striving toward the same goal as the first game, creating the feeling of going on an adventure. The only real metric for comparison is how well they achieve that goal, and frankly, I think trying to determine that objectively is impossible. That's because the way that they try to deliver the feeling of adventure is not just opposite, they're complementary. In the areas that Zelda 1 fails to deliver, Zelda 2 succeeds, and vice versa. One or the other approach will work better for you depending on who you are. Personally, I like what Zelda 2 is doing more than Zelda 1. But when you step back to look at them together, neither feels whole without the other. That's why it's so interesting to look back at these games specifically. With the benefit of future knowledge, I'll go ahead and spoil that the Zelda series goes on to find balance between freedom of exploration and structured, cohesive worlds. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that a huge part of why this series has been so long-lasting and so beloved is that it consistently reaches that balance. So when you look to the beginning and see that not only do the first two games not have that balance at all, but also that they individually represent the extreme ends of that spectrum, well, it's worth talking about. In fact, it makes me a little miffed that more people don't talk about it. When discussing the series, people tend to gloss over the NES games and the impact that they had, just because they aren't as good as what comes later. Zelda 2 especially gets a lot of hate online, and while I do see the complaints, I don't think people give this game enough credit. It's rough, and it's flawed, and it's not for everyone, but this is where the series started to take its world building seriously. It isn't just some black sheep that you can write off as not special. It's an important step in understanding what Zelda will become. And as we move forward into what most people would call the good era of Zelda games, I want that to be the major takeaway from the NES era. Collectively, these first two games laid the groundwork for what the series would become. Both of them were held back by the technology of their time, but the seeds are planted right here. And luckily, hardware won't be a problem for much longer. Next time we're jumping forward a console generation, to the game that a lot of people will say is still their favorite Zelda game to this day. Please, join me next time when we talk about The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you there.